This is a brand new Audi RS3, and it is my favorite Audi. Yes, including the R8 supercar and the Q7 that everyone's been raving about, and the new Q5 and the A5 Sportback and the RS7 and blah, blah, blah. This is my favorite new Audi. And today, I'm going to show you why. I'll start with a little background. Now, regular Audi models are named A4, A6, A8, and the sporty versions replace the A with an S, so it's S4, S6, S8. But the really sporty Audi models, the really high-performance ones, start with RS. Unfortunately, those have mostly been reserved for Europe. Up until a few years ago, the only RS models Audi ever sold in North America were the RS6 in 2003 and the RS4 for a couple of years in the mid-2000s. That changed recently, and now the RS3 is one of 3 RS models in Audi's lineup, along with the RS5 and the RS7. Now, in North America, we still don't get my favorite Audi RS car, the RS6 Avant, so instead, the RS3 is my favorite, by far. So why exactly do I love it? It's simple, because this car just isn't overkill. When I was in college, I had a first-generation Audi A4, and I loved that car. It was the perfect size. But the A4 has been redesigned 4 times since then, and it's just gotten bigger and larger and more bloated. The current A3 is the same size as that old A4, and it's perfect for cities. It's zippy and it's tiny. You can squeeze through spaces and into parking lots. It's just right. I also love the RS3 because the performance isn't overkill. Yeah, the new Audi RS7 is a really cool car, but it's got 605 horsepower. The E63 AMG, the new M5, also have around 600 horsepower. That's fun for a little while, but it's just too much to really actually use. This thing is right at 400 horsepower, and it's just the perfect amount. You can actually enjoy it without the fear of winding up in jail. So I've borrowed this RS3 from a viewer near Baltimore, and today I'm going to show you around it and show you all of the quirks and features of Audi's best car, which, by the way, starts around $55,000, although the average sticker price seems to be closer to $65,000 with options and extras. Anyway, then I'm going to drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the RS3, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of the 5 best Audi models ever sold in the United States. I'm going to start under the hood, where you can gaze at the RS3's 2.5-liter 5-cylinder, 400 horsepower. Under the hood, it's not really all that quirky, except you can see that they've painted the little plastic engine cover red on the top of the cylinders, I guess just to emphasize that this is a little sportier than a regular Audi A3 if you look under the hood. Next up, moving on to the front grille, you can see that it has the Audi logo, of course, and it also says RS3 to remind you and everyone else that you got the top-of-the-line A3. But the coolest thing down there is the Quattro script on the bottom of the front grille. That is unique to the RS3. The S3 doesn't have it. So if you see one of these coming at you and it says Quattro on the bottom, you know it's an RS3. Next up, we move on to the brakes. The especially unusual thing to me about the brakes is the fact that this car comes with optional carbon ceramic brakes. Now, this particular one doesn't have them, but if you pay $4,800 extra, you can get the Dynamic Plus package, which includes carbon ceramic brakes. The strange thing is, if you get the carbon ceramic brakes, you only get 2. They put them up front. You don't get carbon ceramic brakes in back, so you get sort of a half carbon ceramic brake setup. Maybe more interesting than all that, however, is this little plastic piece on the wheel arch. You can see right above the tire, they've installed this. These are being installed at the port on all the RS3s. The tires are so wide that they stick just a little bit out from the fender, and apparently there's some regulations saying that they can't do that, so Audi had to enlarge the fender with this tacked-on plastic piece in order to make the car meet our regulations. So anytime you see an RS3, take a look on the wheel arch, and you will also see this weird plastic piece. Next up on the outside, we move on to the front turn signals. They're not all that unusual. You have the little LED running light that's on. You put on the turn signal, the LED light turns off, and the signal blinks. It is kind of a cool process to watch, but it's nowhere near as cool as the rear turn signals. These are the rear turn signals, and they are some of the coolest in the car industry. When you put on the turn signal, they sort of like stream. They start on the inside and move their way out with every blink, which is a really cool look. But you might be wondering, well, if it's doing that, why does it also need this little light flashing? Well, that's because the US government has a regulation that specifies exactly how much light must light up on the turn signal's first flash. In this car, the first flash is all the way over here, and it's just one of these little LEDs that then expands out, and it doesn't meet the regulation. So Audi had to add a supplemental turn signal down here in addition to the flashing light above it that everybody else thinks is really cool. In Europe and basically every other market, they just have the light on the top, but here we get this one also. Our next interesting exterior quirk is the mirrors. Now, in Audi S and RS cars, one of their signature design elements is silver mirror caps. Interestingly, this car also offers a blackout package or carbon fiber mirror caps, but silver is sort of like Audi's thing, and so this one has the silver mirror caps. You can see it also has a turn signal mounted in the mirror. That's pretty standard. The odd thing is that there's also a little turn indicator mounted on the inside of the mirror, I guess so you can see it while you're sitting behind the wheel. This isn't for drivers like sitting behind you on the road because it's aimed directly into the driver's seat. I guess it's just another way you can tell if your turn signal is on. The next interesting exterior quirk of the RS3 is the sunroof. Now, if you take a look at the sunroof in its closed position, you can see that it's quite large. It's like 2.5 feet of glass. It's really impressive. But if you actually open the sunroof, you can see it sort of slides above the roof of the car, and when it's stopped, well, this is all you get. You only get like a foot of actual open space compared to like 3 feet of sunroof. Now, one other interesting thing about the sunroof is that when it's open, it's just sort of sitting out here over the roof of the car. There's nothing propping it up back here. Instead, it's all supported over here, which is pretty impressive because this is a large glass panel, and I can imagine that it's pretty heavy. Another cool sunroof feature, that would be the wind deflector, and I'm not talking about this one. There's a separate interior wind deflector that you can pull closed when the sunroof is open, and it's sort of like mesh, so it kind of keeps out the actual sun, and that way you can have some shade, you can have your sunroof open, and you can hear your exhaust all at once. The owner of this car tells me he keeps the sunroof open and the mesh thing closed pretty much every time he drives the car, unless it's raining. The next cool exterior item in this car relates to the doors. Specifically, when the doors are open, instead of regular boring puddle lamps, you get a little projection that says Audi Sport. Now, you can't see it here because it's a little bit too bright out. You can mostly see it at night, but check this out. If I put my hand under it, you can see it's projecting Audi Sport onto my hand. Now, these puddle lights that have like logos in them are not that uncommon in the car business anymore, but the interesting thing about this one is it has a little red hash on the left side, the Audi Sport logo. I've never seen one that's colorized before. I guess we're getting into a brave new world in the future of puddle lamps. Next, we move on to the inside, and the first thing I want to talk about up here is virtual cockpit. Now, this is Audi's like infotainment center, and there's this infotainment screen in the middle, just like in a lot of cars, but check out this gauge cluster. It's very configurable, and look at this. If you have it on the navigation view, it shows a Google Map image of where I'm currently sitting. While you're driving along, you can look at the Google Maps satellite view of where you're driving along. This is the coolest infotainment technology in the car business today. It is incredibly, incredibly cool and very configurable, as I will show you. But before I do that, let me show you this. You can zoom out from where you are if you don't want to see directly what street you're on, and you can zoom all the way out, and then you can see where you are on the globe. You can even see a little bit of space, which is a nice little touch. Also interesting in virtual cockpit, like most cars, it has multiple trip odometers, but unlike most cars, it doesn't say trip A, trip B, trip C. Instead, it says short-term memory and long-term memory. Long-term memory is like since you last reset it. Short-term is like since you last turned on the car and started your trip. Now, like I mentioned, this was configurable, and I showed you before the giant map in the middle, but you don't have to have that in the middle. If you want, you can have your speedometer in the middle, or you can have various other different things. You can see just about anything you want projected directly in front of you on this really high quality screen. Now, a lot of you are going to say, well, that'll break in 15 years and it'll suck. Yeah, that's true, but if you own this thing under warranty, if you're leasing this thing, this is the coolest technology in the business, in my opinion. I used to think Tesla had the best of these infotainment systems. Volvo's is really good, but Audi's is now the #1. And the virtual cockpit is especially cool because it isn't the only screen. It's supplemented by the screen in the middle, which has a lot of cool features on its own, and I'll get to those in a minute. First, I want to talk about some of the other interesting interior quirks in this car, and I'm going to start with the seats. Now, if you take a look at the seats, they are beautiful. Really nice quilted leather. They say RS. They're these cool sports seats. The problem is they're manual, and no matter how much you spend on this car, you can't get power seats. So you're looking at a $65,000 car with manual seats. And not only is it manual seats, but this is one of those cars where you gotta like pump up a lever in order to move the seat like you're sitting in a Hyundai from 1996, except you're actually sitting on a really nice sports seat in a $65,000 brand new Audi. One interesting item with the seats, they do have one power setting that's lumbar, 4-way power lumbar support, giving you a hint of what you could have had if they offered power seats, but they don't. Next up, we must discuss the gear lever, which is kind of entertaining. Now, Audi doesn't offer this with a manual transmission. Instead, it's this really quick dual clutch, of course, but there's sort of a manual look-alike shift lever. It has the shaft and the ball on the top, just like most manual transmission levers, even though it's actually for an automatic, maybe to kind of let you reminisce about your days of driving a manual, even though you don't have one. Next up, we move on to the cup holders, which are almost kind of like a joke. They're placed directly under the climate controls, and when I say under, I mean actually under. You can't fit anything large in the cup holders because they would kind of smush up against the climate controls. Another interior item I like is the climate controls. When you're driving along, you have the climate control off. They're just sort of black to match the rest of the interior, but when you turn the climate controls on, the little dials let you adjust temperature, light up in this bright blue and red so that you can easily see if you want colder or warmer air. Turn it off and they go back to being black so they don't disturb you and add extra colors to your life if you don't want them. Another interesting button is located just to the right of the steering wheel, and it says Drive Select on it. Now, this is the drive mode selector button. It lets you choose between several different drive modes. There's Comfort, Auto, Dynamic, and Individual. But the interesting thing about the drive mode select button is the fact that if you go into Individual, which allows you to configure the drive mode for all the various different car systems, you can not only configure it for engine and transmission and suspension, but you can even configure the drive mode for engine sound and adaptive cruise control. You can configure the drive mode for the adaptive cruise control. In other words, if you want the car to be super aggressive, you can switch to BMW driver. No, I'm kidding. But you can change how aggressive the adaptive cruise control system is. And speaking of that infotainment screen, it's worth pointing out another one of the buttons in the center of the car also has an interesting infotainment function. It can retract the screen so it can fully drop all the way down into the dashboard. Now, since you have the virtual cockpit in the gauge cluster, you don't really need this screen in the middle. It's sort of supplementary since you can control most of the stuff in the gauge cluster, so you could drive with the infotainment screen down and your dashboard uncluttered if that's what you wish. Our next interesting infotainment item is destination entry, when you're trying to tell the navigation system where you want to go. Now, in most cars, a little keyboard pops up on the screen, and then you have to manually scroll over to each individual letter A, B, C in order to tell it where you want to go. But in this car, you can type with your finger. Check this out. I make a little motion down in this pad in the center, and then whatever I typed appears on the screen, and it's actually really good at picking up what I've written. And if I decide I want to go back and delete what I've just written, you just move a line backwards and then it deletes. If you want to do a space, you move a line forward and then there's a little space. It is really good at picking this up, and it's so easy to use. Next up, we have to go into some of the interesting quirks and features you will find if you go deep into the infotainment system displays and menus that most people probably won't see. I'm going to start with speed warning. Now, a lot of European cars have a speed warning system. You can set it at like 80 and then it'll beep to let you know that you're going 80 and therefore maybe you're violating the speed limit, you want to slow down. In this car, you can set the speed warning all the way up to 150 miles an hour. So if you want the car to beep to let you know you're going 150 and you might want to slow down, well, you can do that. The funny thing is this car is electronically limited to 155, so it'll beep and then you'll just run out of engine a few miles an hour later. Next up in the driver assistance menu, we move on to something called Audi Side Assist. Everybody else calls this blind spot monitoring, and basically it lets you adjust the brightness of the blind spot monitors on the mirrors that let you know if a car is in your blind spot. This isn't all that unusual. What is unusual is you got 6 different settings, so you can go in there and choose between 6 different levels of blind spot monitor brightness, which seems kind of unusual to me. I mean, is anybody actually saying to themselves, you know, it's pretty bright, I wish it was just a little no, that's too dim, little brighter, little brighter. And speaking of brightness, the blind spot monitor brightness has nothing on the interior lighting brightness. Go into vehicle settings and you can change the brightness of the interior lights. That's pretty common. What's unusual is you can change the brightness individually of the front interior lights, the door interior lights, and the footwell interior lights. If, for example, you think your footwell needs to be brighter, but your door should be dimmer, and maybe the front should just be somewhere in between. Next up, we move on to maybe my favorite infotainment system quirk, and that would be the ringtones. Now, if you Bluetooth your phone, you can have various different ringtones that alert you when someone is calling. This one is Moon. Okay, that's incredibly annoying, but my favorite of the ringtones is voice. Take a listen. This is an actual option.
You have an incoming call.
Good, so it kind of lets you know that
you have an incoming call.
And that's important. I mean, if you don't want, you know, this is Hunt. And then here's classic phone. But really, that's really annoying. But none of those compare really to the guy telling you.
Incoming call.
You have an incoming call. I mean, you gotta know, and with that guy you do. Now, the other interesting thing about the cell phone settings in this car has something called a cell phone reminder. A few cars have this, but I'm gonna demonstrate it for you. If you plug your phone into the car, so it's on one of the USB ports in the car, then you turn the car off and open the door and start to leave without unplugging your phone, the car reminds you that your phone is still in it. Take a look.
Your cell phone is still in the vehicle.
Another interesting item under the navigation settings, that would be trailer mode. I guess you can choose trailer mode maybe if you're towing a trailer and so you're going to be on streets you don't want like narrow turns where a trailer might not work. So you can put your RS3 in trailer mode to let your navigation system know that you're towing with your RS3. Finally, by far the most annoying part of the infotainment system, that award goes to the MMI touch volume person. MMI is Audi's multimedia interface. It's basically the whole infotainment system, and the touch volume thing allows you to choose sort of where the volume of all the sounds that you hear coming out of the system. But take a listen to what happens when you actually go to adjust it.
MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume.
Yes, basically this person comes on there and says MMI touch volume over and over as you're adjusting it so you can hear exactly what volume you want it to be on. And just in case you didn't catch that.
MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume. MMI touch volume.
Finally, moving on to the back seat. Now, this is a fairly standard back seat. It is pretty tight. One of the interesting things is it does have that same nice quilted leather from the front brought back here. It just looks really nice. It's a lot better than a lot of back seats in cars like this. Another interesting quirk is on the door, there is a door lock button that controls the door locks. Strangely enough, it doesn't have an unlock button. You can only lock the doors if you're sitting in the back seats. So if you press that lock button, you better be really committed to locking the doors because, well, you won't be unlocking them. Also interesting is the fact that at the rear of the front center console, there are air vents for the rear seats. Now that's not uncommon, especially in luxury cars. Most cars have that. The weird thing is because of the size of the console and the rear seat, the air vents are incredibly tiny. In fact, I could put 2 fingers over them and completely cover the vents. Nonetheless, they're there, even though they're small. The other interesting thing in the back seat is the rear cup holders, which come out of the center console here. You put the center console down, you push this, and then the cup holders come out. Oddly, they're square-shaped for all your square-shaped drinks, but they can kind of expand if you need them to, which makes them far more usable than the front cup holders, which is weird because, well, this is the rear seats.
And one other item, have a quick listen to the rather aggressive and delightful exhaust note.
So that's a tour of the Audi RS3, and now it's time to do something I've wanted to do ever since I heard Audi was bringing this thing to the United States. I'm gonna drive it. I'm driving the RS3 finally. I've wanted to drive this car since day one, since they first announced it, because it's just the size of my old B5A4 and it's just perfect, and I'm just very excited about that. Well, first impression, the shifts are really, really quick. I mean, I'm just going normal speeds, but I'm kind of downshifting just to play with it. They're really fast. That's not that unusual. Everybody's got fast shifts now and dual clutches. The interesting thing about this car is you can instantly tell that there is a lot of torque, which is unusual. Usually a car with a 2-point-something inline something doesn't feel like it actually has that much torque. This thing, I drop it a couple gears, I'm at 4,500 RPM. Whoa, whoa. Whew. Wow. Man, it's quick. It's super quick. You can tell instantly. This is what the S3 needed. The S3 that I drove, it was great, but like it really needed this extra kick. And again, the thing that I knew I would love about this car and do love is just how like spry it is and zippy. You know, you get it in like an S8 and it feels fast and you can floor it and go on the highway and you're going 90 and you feel stable. But this thing, you can kind of dart through traffic and move around, and it's just such a, that's the whole point of a car this size that's fast and fun. The steering wheel feels great. I love this Alcantara, this fuzzy little feel. This is how all wheels should be. But of course, you know, there's a wear issue there, but it was a brand new car, and so it feels wonderful right now. Flat bottom wheel like a real sports car. In traffic, it feels nice. I mean, we're kind of going in and out, lower speeds and stuff, and it feels good. One complaint I often have about dual clutches is they can get kind of jerky in traffic. This one doesn't really feel like that. The car's nice and quiet. It feels like a luxury car. Sitting at a stoplight, you don't hear anything else from the outside. When you're in comfort mode, the ride quality is certainly better. Man, it's just so placeable. Like, you can just put it anywhere you want to on the... It's just so much fun, and you can just kind of tap the throttle. And again, I'm not going 80 when I hit the throttle. I can floor it coming up to a red light and not hit 90 and have to slam on the brakes, whatever. Like, it's just kind of fun. It's just enjoyable. Going around that corner, there's very little body roll. I mean, it's a small car. They're able to kind of keep it composed. All right, so I'm going to try launch control now. We're going to see how it is. Oh my God. Whoa. Wow. You know, this thing was fast driving it around just a second ago, but that was insane. That was great. This car's great. This car's everything I hoped it would be and want it to be, and now I really want one of these, as I do sometimes when I finish these videos. And so there you have it, the Audi RS3. Now, if you get one of these, you're not cooler than someone who has an Audi RS7 or a BMW M5. You're just not. They've spent more money than you, they got more car than you, they got more power than you, they're cooler than you. But there's something about getting a car that has just the right amount of power and just the right size and spending just the right amount of money. Yeah, the RS7 and the M5 are cool, but a lot of the people who have them are spending $2 grand a month to lease a car whose horsepower is used more often to brag to people, I got 600 horsepower, than actually on the street. Those cars are awesome. To be clear, I love them, but they're triumphs of excess. The RS3 is just right. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I think the RS3 is handsome, more than usual for a sedan, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration, it does 0 to 60 in an amazing 3.6 seconds, which gives it an 8 out of 10. Handling is good, but not quite true sports car good, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor is high among car enthusiasts, though the general public would generally ignore it, and it gets a 6 out of 10. As for importance, it's a nice luxury car, but another high-performance Audi doesn't quite grant it ultra-important status, and it gets a 5 out of 10, bringing the weekend score to a strong 32 out of 50. That ties the RS3 with the Honda S2000, in part because the Audi is just so damn fast in a straight line. Next up are the daily categories. Features are good and plentiful, but it's missing some important stuff, and manual seats is just embarrassing, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort is surprisingly good for a sporty car like this, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is high, the interior is wonderful, and while I worry about long-term reliability, I'm still giving it a 7 out of 10. Practicality is only okay. The trunk is shockingly small, and the back seats aren't huge, but at least it has them and rear doors. Still, it gets only a 4 out of 10, which is weak for a sedan. Finally, there's value, and it's a good one. It's fun, it's fast, it's cool, it's reasonably practical, and it gets a 7 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to 31 out of 50. Add it all up, and the Doug score is 63, and here's a comparison against some similar cars. I reviewed the BMW M2 before I created the Doug score, so I went back and scored it, and the M2 slightly edges out the RS3 in the weekend score, but it loses overall as the RS3 is just more practical. In the end, the RS3 is a surprisingly good weekend car that can also be a great daily driver.
MMI touch volume. 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 MMI touch volume.